Okay, here we are. Another day, another dollar.
Hey, y'all.
We got a really awesome interview coming up.
Very cool.
It's with Gavan Wilhite, who is one of Forbes 30 under 30 for co-founding his company AltSpace VR. And seems like they're a virtual reality company.
Yeah, they do VR in a kind of like social context.
Right.
So think of it like a social media platform for VR.
Right, but and it seems like one of the kind of his claims to fame,
right? Well, sure.
Is basically making a VR world for Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons, and I mean the thing is, I think that the game applications for VR are like really clear.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, and you guys will hear it. What's interesting is he talks about the social applications for VR, which is pretty fascinating.
Right. And they're already doing kind of like hosting. He actually, I mean, you'll hear it as well. But we ended up even talking about potentially eventually hosting a podcast in VR.
Tell us what you think about that, by the way.
In virtual reality. I don't really know what that would look like, but it could be cool.
Yeah.
I think they just had, who did you say? Reggie Watts?
Reggie Watts, yeah, that's right.
Reggie Watts did stand up in virtual reality for them, which is, I don't even know how that works, to be honest, but it sounds cool.
It sounds awesome. And we were talking before the interview, Gavin's a buddy of mine from years and years ago. And I know that they just got another round of funding, and it was like this large amount of money,
right.
Millions and millions of dollars. And I don't know if that's public. Sorry, Gavin.
Yeah.
But I know that like essentially there's a VR bubble right now in Silicon Valley.
Totally.
And
and AI probably are like the shit.
And exactly. And AR too. And the differences between VR and AR we go into in this interview. But it's interesting because
by AR we mean augmented reality versus virtual reality.
Right. One being immersive, the other one sort of being complementary in your visual space.
Right.
And, Ari and I were talking before we got on about what is this whole VR thing? Like, what does it mean for our generation?
How do we feel about this?
Right. And what should we feel about it as, or not should be, but how should we orient to it as millennials?
Or just as human beings.
Sure.
And it was really interesting talking to him about it because he's like an exceedingly rational dude, and you guys will hear that
by design.
Right, totally by design. But one thing that I think is really interesting that I don't think we really got into as much is, so how is if there's this VR bubble and there's going to be more and more time that collectively we're spending in virtual reality versus in our reality, this physical reality, how is that going to change our behavior? How is it going to change how we we already see how social media affects the ways that we interact and affects our behavior. And
totally.
I was even thinking, sorry, this is a tangent, but just
brother, go.
Thinking about how social media and how basically information, we each have our own echo chambers of information, and how that's affecting everything, all of the choices we make, including this crazy political dog and pony show that's currently underway.
Yes.
But really kind of what I was going back to is like, how is virtual reality going to affect our society? How is, what's this going to mean for us? Yeah.
And it's like, I'm glad you made the immediate comparison to social media, because in my mind, there are these things that appear that at a certain point, there's a tipping point where everybody has to reckon with them in some way. Yeah. Like, for example, I'm not on social media, but there's the tipping point happened where I have to reckon with it at work.
Right.
It's my job. Part of my job, major parts of my job is to reckon with social media.
Right. Even doing this podcast, like
exactly.
It's like we wouldn't, the very idea that we're sitting in my bedroom and recording something that, hopefully a lot of people will listen to is really crazy. But the avenue or the pathway to that happening is through this crazy social media thing that didn't even exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever.
So it's easy to talk about the sort of coercive or what's the other word? it's like corrupting qualities of social media, right? And I think the same could be said for VR.
Right.
And more to the point, it's like, okay, at a certain point, either we're going to have to reckon with VR or we're not. And it seems like we probably will have to reckon with either VR or AR at some point in the next 10 years.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it's happening regardless.
Everybody's going to have to reckon with it. So I think we need to take the lessons we learned from social media and how everybody started reckoning with it.
That's a great idea.
And realize that now at the end of the tail, it's just the folks who said, okay, here are the right ways to use it. Here are the ethical ways to use it. Here are the money-making effective ways to use it.
And we've had conversations with other people that we'll have on the podcast as well about this idea of design ethics. And I recommend there's this Medium post by a guy named Tristan Harris.
Amazing.
Who
future guest talks about him.
Yeah. Future guests will talk about him. Who started a company I think it's called Time Well Spent. And it's basically all about, he used to be a design ethicist at Google. And it's about how, this post is about how, the social media technology, all the Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, all this stuff is designed to make us use it as much as possible.
Correct.
And the kind of the ethical implications behind that and how that's affecting the rest of our lives.
And just to make it crystal clear, the reason is because they're free.
Right.
The longer you spend in it, the more absorption you have of advertisers.
Totally.
Right. And because they can't just do pay to play.
Sure.
They need a revenue model that's it's quantity. It's quantity.
Right. And it's become
duration based,
right? Where we are now, and I mean, we even, our podcast is an example of this. Or any podcast is the most valuable commodity in this world now is attention,
right? Because
it's such there's a glut of stuff to consume,
right?
And so now, rather than there being a scarcity of 3 TV channels, there's you can learn about everything ever. And I think from my point of view, at least, VR is just going to accelerate that exponentially.
Totally.
Not only are you going to be able to learn about everything, you're going to be able to immerse yourself in everything.
Right.
So now people are worried about the Syrian war, which, is a terrible thing. And we don't need to get into that right now, but worried about all these events all over the world. And that's taking them away from, where they are in their life presently.
Totally.
And I think VR has the potential to, instead of reading an article about something, you're there instead.
Well, I don't know if you did this by design, but the best example of VR that I've seen
is the New York Times thing,
is the UN thing.
Oh, I didn't see this.
It was you probably did. We might even be talking about the same thing. It's in a Syrian refugee camp.
I did see this.
So you pop the goggles on and there you are.
Right.
You're there with a family. Actually, it starts with a little girl and you're sitting across from a little girl and you feel what it's like to be in the internally displaced person's tent that she lives in.
Right.
And you walk outside and you see the line with the barbed wire and the kids walking by.
Right.
And you're there.
And I am happy to make an argument that that's a net positive for society.
But again, it's how.
Right.
Right. So with social media, right? Mm-hmm. You look at Anthony fucking Weiner, you look at these people and it's like they fucked up on social media.
Right.
They used it improperly.
Well, those are individuals, but I even think probably the greater danger is as a collective. What happens when more than half of the population is spending at least 3 hours a day in virtual reality?
Well, and let's think about it. So,
those are totally arbitrary numbers.
But the point is clear. And here's the thing, right? What you're basically doing is giving that time over to a corporation, right?
Sure.
So if you're not getting paid commensurate with that time, there's an imbalance, right? Now, you might be getting pleasure out of it, which is another thing, right? But what are you actually deriving pleasure from, right?
Yeah.
What is it? Is it distracting you from the anxieties and depressions?
And I think that's, to me, that seems like the likeliest culprit.
Totally. But if you're in social media 3 hours a day raising money for something you really believe in.
But let's be honest with ourselves. That's very much the minority of people that are on social media.
Totally.
And so I think what'll be interesting, and we're definitely already seeing, changes in our behavior and changes in the way that we interact, but it's interesting to see, to think about the possibilities of how our I mean, you can kind of go down the rabbit hole with this, but for instance, if before you and I, came here to record this, if we had spent the previous 3 hours like fully immersed in an Amazonian jungle, running from conquistadors, like how is that going to change how we are once we take the goggles off? Like how is our behavior and our everything going to change?
Absolutely.
And so I think
I'll make a really provocative analogy.
Great.
If you're watching porn for 3 hours,
which I think is going to be the first thing to hit with VR,
of course,
yeah.
But just think about from the pre-VR context. If you're watching porn for 3 hours and then you go on a date,
right?
It's a very different date.
Sure.
Most men have experienced this in some way. Even if you're watching a sexy movie, like sorry if this is offending anybody, but if you're watching a sexy movie,
sure.
How if the movie's like enticing and maybe there's a flash of a tit, but you guys are but
got
you're
a
in
little tit flash.
Yeah, there's a little tit flash, but it's more titillating.
Oh, titillating.
That is a different like preamble to your date moment.
Sure, of course.
That might entice the sex.
You're going to show up in a different way,
right? But if you're there watching, people doing that,
yes, then
it's a completely different vibe, right?
Totally.
So just extrapolate that to this immersion thing we're talking about.
Well, what I think is going to be really interesting is I think we're going to see a huge uptick in disassociative behavior stuff. And like people who, legally will it be a defense if somebody thinks they're in virtual reality and kills somebody and it doesn't have the capacity to be able to tell the difference between virtual and real reality. There's an impulse now in artists to discuss this hardcore. So there's a new show about this on HBO. I've seen plays about this recently. It's Anthony Hopkins' Westworld or something. Oh, like that's that show.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I heard about
that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, it's going to be super good. Yeah.
But so, on the positive side, though, if you look at VR as this way to connect people, which is what Gavin's doing with AltSpace VR, has powerful abilities to be more interpersonal when you're doing business with people abroad.
Totally.
Families will feel closer together.
There's ways to, think about a lot of the amazing stuff that Bernie Sanders was able to do in galvanizing a lot of people to come together.
Totally.
Think about, the same possibilities I'm sure are true in VR. And if you're fully immersed in a group of what feels like a big crowd, you're going to get the same kind of visceral feelings that you do from being at a rally, probably. Yeah.
And so on the one hand, it's like when you look at the emergence of the social media bubble, it's like, all right, I see the emergence of the VR bubble. All that money's what is that investment for? It's so that there's a return on that investment at the end of the day, right? Of course.
But that means there's going to be advertising.
But they just did it again. Like there've been a few bubbles. There was the internet bubble. There's the social media bubble. There's this. Then there's this thing. Maybe I'm hopeful that they'll do it. I don't know. A little bit more ethically this time. Perhaps they will. We'll see. They may.
Gavin seems like he's a pretty ethical dude.
Yeah, he is. And yeah, that's right. The industry at large, no, they're going to do the same shit they always do. Yeah. They're going to, it's going to be driven by the id, right?
Or no, it's going to be driven by the dollar.
The dollar, but which is associated with people's
ego.
Yeah. And egos.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, anyway, for the foreseeable future, though, we're going to have to reckon with VR, I think.
And it's also really exciting. And I've gotten a chance to experience it and it was amazing. Yeah. And super real. Felt like reality. So we're going to have to see on that.
This AR, I think the AR stuff's going to have tremendous.
Magic Leap. That's my shit.
Yeah.
If you haven't looked up, go look up Magic Leap. There's like a couple videos online. I think Wired did a couple like video stories on YouTube you can find.
Their biggest investors, Jack Ma.
Yeah, the Alibaba guy.
Yeah.
And like Disney.
Right.
Like I think it's the largest they've put like in startup funding like $1 billion into it already.
I think even maybe more.
It's a crazy fucking thing. You should check it out. Really cool. Anyways, we're going long here on this intro, but we obviously are passionate about it, and
I think it had something to do with.
Might have had something to do with the morsos we just fucking.
I had
ate.
2.
Yeah, I only had one because I have already had like 3 coffees today.
But we didn't have time for the coffee.
We didn't have time.
We didn't want to brew up.
Exactly. And it's also a little later in the day. So we're like, okay, I want to fall asleep tonight. I don't want to be super wired, but
we're energized.
We're recording an intro. It's got to be good. So I'm going to have a fucking coffee and cream and be ready to go. Anyways, we're talking about, obviously, Il Morso, if you've listened before.
The coffee bar.
The coffee bar. You can find them at ilmorso.com. You enter promo code Millennials, and you'll get 15% off. It's a great, great thing to have. You just pop one or two in the morning. Very affordable. I think cost per unit is something like maybe like about $1, which is a great deal. Yeah. If you're buying a coffee every morning, you're saving yourself like
$3,
$2 a day, $3 a day. So that's a great deal.
And if you go online, you enter that promo code Millennials, then you help us out. You help keep the podcast going. It's a win-win-win.
It's all good. Anyways, get ready to listen to Gavin. We loved it. Hopefully he liked it.
He's a smart guy.
He's a very smart dude.
We all have to work to catch up, to keep up.
And Gavin, you are the founder and director of engineering at AltSpace VR.
Yeah, that's correct.
And also, we've known each other for a little while, Gavin. We should, for full disclosure's sake,
of course,
Gavin and I have bounced around in each other's lives for a while, and pleasurably so.
Yep.
So, Gavin, what are you working on right now at AltSpace? Give folks a little bit of context of what AltSpace is and what you're doing there.
Sure. So AltSpace is essentially a social VR platform. So there's all these new VR devices that have been coming out. The Oculus Rift, people have heard about, the Gear VR. So they're basically, if you imagine sort of having like a phone screen that sort of goes in front of your eyes, and when you're looking sort of through it, it sort of seems like you're inside of like a video game world.
Right.
So we sort of use those and let people, if multiple people have them, they can sort of all put them on together and they can be inside the same space together. Right. So that's for like, we host like VR comedy shows. We'll like let people play tabletop games like D&D, which I know Matt knows well. We'll also let people host like office meetings and stuff like that. So just sort of establishing a new way of people to communicate online.
Right on. And what does director of engineering do, and what does that look like, and what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I can tell you it's changed a lot over the last year and a half or whatever it's been. But it's probably about you can say sort of like a third is like recruiting, a third is sort of what you expect from sort of management or team organization, and then a third of it's sort of on the ground software engineering.
Nice.
And you're the founder as well. And what kind of pointed you towards the VR space?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my background is in video games. It's what I studied in school. I worked at Disney for a number of years. But I've always been sort of interested in how you can use sort of the principles and technology that are behind gaming sort of for other things. So at Disney, I was working on education. And then when I saw VR, I was like, this is awesome. I can use all this stuff that I already know to do some crazy things like letting people, hang out together online or we just got Reggie Watson there with like a crazy mocap suit. So you could like watch him right in front of you making these jokes. Yeah. So
that's amazing.
That's so cool.
And so take us through the process of when did you start this company?
Yeah, so that was, let's see, it's been about 2.5 years now since we sort of kicked it off, and it was the timing all was pretty nice. Within maybe 3 or 4 months of sort of getting together with my co-founder, we sort of had some funding, and then it's just been sort of building the team since then, and we've been live for just over a year now.
Wow. And how did you what was the initial funding process like? Like we hear a lot about that online. We read a lot about finding funding in Silicon Valley.
Or watch Silicon Valley.
Valley.
And I can't watch that show. It's a little too close to home.
That's what everyone that I talk to in Silicon Valley says. They're like, yeah, I've heard it's right on, but I just can't do it.
Yeah. Well, I have to give lots of props to my co-founder. He's just a rock solid business guy. And he had a big solar company before, so he was able to lead the charge through most of that. So it was, for at least from my perspective, it was a very painless experience. But I know he pounded the pavement for a long time. So,
and in doing so, since you're kind of, I guess, on the more of the engineering side, how do you differentiate yourself? Because I would imagine, at Silicon Valley, there's probably hundreds of VR startups that are trying to kind of muscle their way in. What was it that separated you to a point where it's like, okay, yeah, people with money say, okay, we want to give you money and invest in what you're trying to do?
Yeah. Well, so one thing that I have learned to think about as far as startups are concerned is there's sort of like two major categories of things. Like one is like, what is the tractability of sort of the idea or the company, right? Like, is it the right time? Like, do you have the right team? Is the market right? Like there's all this sort of tractability stuff, but then there's also like the second category of if you succeed, like, does it succeed enough, right? Like if you succeed beyond your wildest dreams, is the company large enough for you to actually like achieve what you need to achieve and sort of achieve what the investors need to see as well, right? And so I think almost, well, certainly not uniquely, but of a very few sort of social platforms are one of those things that can actually succeed that large, right?
Right.
You can start building those network effects and just the network gets more and more valuable. So I think that intersection of sort of tractability and potential was very attractive.
Right, because there's VR companies that we've heard about, and there's obviously tons of social media companies that we've heard about. But a VR social media company, it sounds unique. It sounds like something I haven't seen yet, and so you're kind of jumping at that sort of crossroads between those two niches almost.
Yeah, and we try to take a very sort of pragmatic approach to it, right? So you see, like, we have so many sort of stories about these crazy sci-fi metaverses, right? And it's very easy to sort of be seduced by the vision and just try to build exactly as it's written in Ready Player One or exactly as it's written in Snow Crash. But when the sort of
those are two kind of books that are, because I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with books, but those are two books that are kind of seen as the gold standards.
Yeah, those are sort of seen as some of the classic sci-fi examples of these sort of large libertarian virtual worlds, I guess, for the lack of a better word.
Wow.
And so, with us, we really try to make sure that everything is, backed up by data as much as possible, and everything's sort of minimum viable product, get it out there, see if it actually makes sense in the real world. I know one of the things that really struck us there was, when I went into it, and The Matrix is obviously another example, I sort of came into it with that sort of mindset, right? Like, this thing has to be like badass and edgy,
right?
And that's sort of like the emotion that has to come through. But one of the things that we found out very quickly is the most salient emotion for people seemed to be humor. They would get in there and they would just start laughing because, part of it's just sort of this ridiculous thing. It's this new medium, but it's also like you just get a bunch of people together into like a slightly like new social setting, especially people from like all over the world that have like no clue about each other's social customs and stuff like that. And it becomes hilarious very quickly. So
it's funny. It reminds me of like as a teenager playing World of Warcraft and just being in a random, dungeon or something. And then just everybody starts dancing.
Right.
And it's like, wow, there's just all these people all over the world and they're all just dancing for seemingly no apparent reason. So I can see how that dynamic is kind of replicable.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you feel like your demographics right now anyway are mostly millennials? Do you feel like you're like, where are your prime, sort of initial users?
Yeah. And sort of taking this with a grain of salt, none of this is like official or anything, but if I had to, there's definitely like a strong contingent, I think from millennials, sort of from that sort of traditional hardcore gamer demographic, but we try very hard to make the product accessible to sort of a wide variety of ages and genders and places in the world. And I think so part of that is what devices you support. So like we care very hard about supporting mobile VR, so Gear VR and things like that. And you see that like we probably get a much more diverse group of people coming in through that medium. But yeah, I would say, especially coming to like the VR meetups, there's a lot of millennials involved.
And so after it's been live for about a year, right?
Yep.
What would you say has been the most surprising thing after a year? What has kind of caught you by surprise the most, or that you wouldn't have thought would be true?
So I made a little crack about this earlier, but like my job has changed like, I don't know, half a dozen times, and the title stays the same, but like, we went from 2 of us to 40 now, and like each step along the way, it's like, oh wait, I assumed I had this skill, right? Because you just like, the job keeps continuing and you go into work every day, but eventually you realize like, oh, I need this skill to do my job now. I have not developed it yet. I need to like get good at this in like the next week, right? And I think that's the thing that I had just, I did not realize before going into this, and it's been a joy to try to keep up, but it's been a little crazy.
That feels very millennial. I mean, that feels like, we've been talking to a lot of people, and we've been talking about barriers to entry for a lot of different professions and tasks. And millennials seem to be folks who like to self-teach, who like to DIY, who like to sort of take on new things and also get paid for them while they're learning.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, oh yeah, I can do that. And then they go home and they read Reddit and they read, they go on Khan Academy and they learn about it and they come into work the next day and they're like, yeah, I got that skill set.
Right.
Do you experience that throughout the Silicon Valley space or the tech space, or is it mostly a bunch of people who really know what, their skill set is?
Yeah, I think definitely, it's funny. I don't know if anybody at the company works on like the same thing 2 weeks in a row.
Wow.
It's a constant process. And one of the things that's made me, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but there's this amazing rationality community in the Bay Area. And
can you explain for folks who don't know what rationality is?
Sure. Yeah, I know. And it's sort of it's sort of a blanket term that gets thrown around here, but it sort of organized around a couple online communities that were sort of looking and writing and talking about things like human like heuristics and biases. So like there's lots of ways in which we think that have developed through evolution and were like very adaptive to solve like lots of different problems, but have some like failure modes that like crop up from time to time. So you look at things like, what's one of the examples? Confirmation bias, right?
Okay.
So if if you take a person who has one stance on a issue that may be seen as controversial, and they read a news article that backs up their belief, and they read a news article that is counter to their belief gets stronger, right? Where like mathematically it should stay exactly the same. But like everybody wants to find sort of confirming evidence for the things that they believe, and thus they sort of like reinforce their beliefs over and over again.
Right.
And there's reasons why that was sort of adapted back in the day, but now it means that your like beliefs sort of wander off, and it's hard to sort of course correct. So sort of learning about what these different like bugs in the brain are and trying to sort of correct for them was one of the things that was being talked about. There's also just sort of things around like habit formation, but there's a sense of a growth mindset where you can and ought to be sort of better tomorrow than you are today. And that when you like look at a lot of the research, very little actually seems to come down to innate talent, and almost everything seems to be sort of practice, especially sort of dedicated and effective practice. And so that's sort of a big crux of the community out here.
So it's sort of finding new and visionary ways to improve yourself, your work, and the community around you on a daily basis.
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I think, to your point, that crosses from everything from sort of like life hacking to like, what are some of the harder questions of morality that we haven't figured out yet, to like, what is the most effective way to, solve global poverty or, whatever it might be.
Do you find that issues of morality, because I hear this a lot, like, do you find that issues of morality creep up for you while working in the VR space? I mean, I hear, whenever you talk to people who don't know much about VR, inevitably you get into these conversations. Well, people are just going to spend more time in those boxes. And like, and nobody's going to have a real relationship. They're just going to have a VR relationship. And like, that's my old man voice, by the way.
Yeah, it's
but I feel like that's, we hear this a lot when from lay people and from, not just lay people, but everybody about VR. I mean, how do you look at it from a moral standpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's an aspect of it where like being sort of in the trenches, so to speak, it's less about like hypothesizing about like what the future is going to hold for like what VR is going to look like, because it's like, especially in places where VR where it's like seductive to sort of have these crazy sort of sci-fi ideas about stuff. It's sort of, I think it's hard to predict those out, but there is sort of like day-to-day things that come up where we do sort of have to make some moral calls, or where we find ourselves with the ability to sort of influence things in sort of positive directions if we sort of put effort in, X, Y, and Z. So I think that's something that's on our mind a lot. We try to give people the tools to, like, say, self-moderate, to make sure that they don't have to deal with trolls or whatever it might be. But we also want to make sure that, like, one of the things that's really nice about AltSpace is that you'll have these crazy conversations where somebody is logging in from Brazil and somebody is logging in from Saudi Arabia, and they're literally standing right in front of each other and like talking to each other. And it's like a thing that never happens normally. And like, you can have a chat room or a phone call or an online game, but like when you have body language and like, it's like, how do you deal with like personal space boundaries and stuff like that when you have such different
So that was one of my questions was how, obviously social interaction will be different in a virtual space. So you're referencing body language. So how is body language able to be incorporated into the virtual avatar?
Definitely, yeah. So that's a big thing that we care about. So it depends a lot on what sensors you have, and we try to support as many of those as we can. So if you have, say, an HTC Vive, and they look sort of like Wiimotes, like sort of wands or remote controls, those will be tracked. So we can sort of give you like cartoon hands that sort of are where those are. So you can like wave at people or do those sorts of things. We have support for the Leap Motion, so that actually does finger tracking. So as long as you're sort of holding your hands near, like in front of your face, you can sort of wave or like do the peace sign, or you can basically like fist bump. You can sort of do sort of general hand gestures. And then if we're doing like a live event, like with Reggie, we'll actually put a full mocap suit on him. So he'll have every single joint tracked.
Yeah. Got it. So would you foresee potentially in the future if AltSpace was used to broadcast certain events or things like that, then people would just be wearing mocap suits? Yeah,
and we actually, I'm reasonably sure this is public. There's we've seen some really cool companies come out with mocap suits that could plausibly be worn on like a daily basis.
That aren't giant little globe, like snow globes or whatever.
I was wondering about that. Is it going to be consumer facing soon? Like, will I be able to walk for Kmart at some point, buy an Oculus and one of those suits?
Yeah, well, because what they're looking like now is they basically look like you ever see what like football players or athletes will wear, that sort of like Under Armour, sort of like looks like long underwear.
Shorts and stuff.
Yeah. it'll basically look like that, and just like they're called like IMUs. They're sort of like the little sensors that you have in your cell phone that tracks rotation. So it's gyros, compasses, and accelerometers. And so it's just little tiny sort of black cubes that are sort of sewn into them. So there's no like cameras or anything looking at it. It's all sort of self-contained. And
that's really cool.
Yeah, I think the first company, a lot of these are coming out of like Kickstarter and stuff like that. But I think one of the first companies is trying to come out with one pretty soon that's like machine washable, and you just sort of use it like an extra garment. Yeah.
Sounds like there's massive application for that in daily use, for healthcare, for the military.
Are you how I mean, so you've been in kind of like the tech space for how long?
Well, I mean, so I graduated college in 2010.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd say since then.
So since then, would you say that kind of the pace at which technology is accelerating, is that, is it getting quicker? Essentially, like since you started your company, would you say the technology is just getting better and faster and more advanced, at an accelerated pace?
Yeah, I think it depends sort of what what area of technology or what vertical. Like I think it's easy to so like you have things like Moore's law where the computational power of computers or processors sort of goes up, doubles, and you get these exponential curves. Mm-hmm. And there's some areas where that definitely holds, so that like holds true in certain areas of biotech as well. But there's also some places that, like, especially when you're sort of already hitting the edges of modern physics, you really don't see a lot of improvements, right? So if we look at things like a lot of sort of mechanical engineering stuff hasn't changed very much at all in the last 50 years, and you might see maybe 2x improvements or 3x improvements, but you don't get these like 10,000, 100,000, just millionfold improvements where you do in software. So I would say there's this sort of like crazy invisible rapid march where there's just so many subfields now, and everything like is not visible in a way that it used to be. Right. Where I think there is just like massive technology growth in places that people don't notice.
Can you give us an example of that?
Like if you just dig into like any small area of like, it's easier to talk about things that I don't know, right? Because then I can sort of handle it.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, like I guess you can take an example, just like look at a cell phone, right? And there's like all these little tiny components in them, and each one of those just has thousands of people working on them, and like some of those things just would have been impossible, a few years ago. And you look at all these sort of crazy places in biotech where all of a sudden somebody will come out with some new way of editing genes. So I think there's just a ton of sort of, especially in things that are sort of used for industry, right? Like you think about the different manufacturing processes that go into an iPhone, right? And like the ability for, they've now got the unibody design and they're doing some new crazy manufacturing process, right? So a lot of it's behind the scenes, but you do get some
not necessarily consumer facing, but it's still huge advancements.
Right. And it sort of will work its way into consumer products, but not in a way where you sort of notice the slow growth of it.
So Gav, doing all this amazing stuff with AltSpace VR, and we could just go down these rabbit holes one after another because they're all so fascinating, but take us back a little bit. Let's go back to, where you grew up, a little bit about, what brought you to this technology space. You're from Hawaii, right?
I am, yeah. Born and raised. Yeah.
What island?
From Oahu, yeah. So I was out there. One of my favorite things is there was a very good school that I got to go to out there that I'm very thankful for. But graduated from there, and I basically stayed until I was 18. So
you went to the same school as Obama, right?
I did, yeah. It's
nice.
What school? It's a nice place. They do a good job. It's one of those things where it's you don't appreciate it until afterwards, but everybody's sort of driving towards achievement, and they did a good job, of course, of public speaking, right? That's the one that always makes me laugh.
Certainly Obama excelled at that for sure.
Exactly, yeah. That's what
was the school called, Gavin?
It's Punahou School.
Right.
Nice.
And were you always drawn to STEM and technology and programming? Like, how did you first get into computers?
Yeah. I think my first computer class was in preschool, so I think the interest in computers started early. But the way I got into a lot of this stuff was actually through art. I used to do a lot of 3D art, sort of 3D modeling, the kind of stuff that you would see in like video games or Pixar movies or what have you. And the intersection.
How old were you when you started that?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably like 7th or 8th grade, I think.
Nice. And what were those early projects like? Like, what were the nuts and bolts of them? Were you teaching yourself coding, or how did that work?
Yeah, so a lot of it, it's these tools that are just incredibly complicated but incredibly powerful. So if you think of like, if you've heard of like AutoCAD, or if you like imagine what kind of tools that like architects would use, right?
Definitely.
So sort of similar sort of things for 3D artwork. And so, it wasn't necessarily a lot of programming, but it was a lot of like understanding 3D graphics, right? Like what is a mesh? What are vertices? How do you like a little bit of sort of linear algebra and vector math. But it's nice because it's this way where you can sort of like you can just sort of create things out of nothing, right? And I think that's the cool thing that sort of draws people into programming as well, right? You start with nothing, and then either days or weeks or months or whatever later, or maybe even minutes, you sort of have something that never existed before in the universe, right? And I think you could probably make some interesting comparisons to like writing and filmmaking and stuff like that. But it's this sort of creation from nothing, which is very cool.
It's a creative endeavor.
Yeah, definitely.
So you start with these initial projects in middle school, and you're designing cool shapes and modeling things on computers and programs like CAD. Did you start coding in high school, or was that more a college thing?
Yeah, I did a little bit in, we'd make sort of like really basic games. And one of the things, without admitting too much here, one of the things I always tell people when they're like deploying the laptops in school is like, you lock them down, but like don't lock them down too much. Because I think a lot of our programming we learned was to get around, circumvent a lot of the things that they had going on there. We just wanted to watch our Family Guy or play our video games or whatever. And so figuring creative ways around the restrictions was always a good driver. But one of the things that was I really appreciate was I was able to sort of convince a lot of my teachers in high school to let me replace our projects with these 3D animations.
Nice.
Like I didn't end up writing a lot of English papers because I would just like make 3D animations of Beowulf or whatever it happened to be. And so ended up learning a lot of that just throughout high school.
Do you still have some of that stuff?
It's funny. I'm sure I probably do have some of it. In senior year, we did this absolutely crazy project where we it counted for like 4 classes at the same time, but we made this like 12-minute short with like, we had computer graphics and we had stitched in with like these, we had like, we were compositing in like spaceships into like live action footage, and we built like these metal cockpits with green screens and pyrotechnics and all this stuff. And so,
wow.
Yeah, we had a ton of fun. Yeah.
Did the school just give you the resources to be able to do that?
I don't know if that was just all like, scrounging where we could, but they gave us the credit and they gave us the time. So that was all we needed.
Did you have those other kinds of minds around you, or did you feel at that point already like, oh, I'm particularly good at this?
Yeah, it was definitely those were a number of buddies that were always involved. But there always was sort of a yearning for, out here on the mainland, there is more sort of technology at the moment, and I think there was always the desire to get out here. Yeah.
Yeah. What was it like growing up on the Hawaiian Islands? Did you feel? I mean, how did you feel and understand island culture? And how does that relate to computer culture, which seems completely disparate?
Yeah, I don't know. The joke I always make is like, when you're always a little rebellious when you're a kid, right? And when you're rebellious in Hawaii, that means you don't do any of the traditionally Hawaiian things, right? And so, we
So you didn't chill out and surf all day.
Not chill out and surf. I think it was energy drinks and video games and programming.
Nice. What was your favorite game growing up?
Deus Ex. Yeah, no question on that. It's like a sort of like a cyberpunk first-person RPG. It's about like human augmentation and stuff like that. Very very fun game. Yeah,
sounds pretty epic.
Also sounds kind of related to VR.
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of sort of trends. That game. One of the things that amuses me about that game is they built it and then they built the second. The sequel is actually a prequel, but technology changed between the time that they made the first one and the second one, and so they had to like retcon a bunch of stuff.
What's that? What is retcon?
They had to like go back and change. So like one of the examples was in the first one, it was set in like 2050, but they all had like 3x4 monitors, and then widescreen monitors came out, and they're like, well, shit, we can't
Wow.
Yeah. And so in the prequel, they just made everything widescreen monitors, and they're just like, don't like ignore the fact that like we didn't realize that in the first one.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
So you're in high school, you're doing these insane projects, and at what point were you like, oh, okay, this is what I want to do for a living? Or did you kind of know that innately from 7th and 8th grade modeling?
Yeah, I knew that pretty early. That was always, I think one of my good buddies out here now. He works with me at AltSpace. We met at a video game summer camp, like sophomore year of high school. So I think very early on, a lot of us sort of knew that was where we wanted to be.
And did your family understand that this was what you were gonna do? Were they supportive of this?
Yeah, definitely. They've been very supportive throughout all that. But
are your parents in tech?
No, my dad was. He's a dentist, but he was always very sort of up on technology. He got like very early versions of AutoCAD to like design our house with, and
wow, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, he was always out ahead. So
was he teaching you that stuff as he learned it?
Yeah, he was. Up until a point I could.
You were teaching him.
there were some fun stories. There was a. Yeah, I don't know if I need to tell this one. There was a point where he installed spyware on my computer and told me, because I had a computer back in my room, and eventually I had to. I was like trying to figure out how the hell to get this thing off, and it was like military grade spyware that somehow he'd gotten a hold of, and
of course.
Eventually, the only thing I could come up with was I installed a second piece of spyware on my computer, so I could get his password when he logged into his, and then I could just go in and selectively edit anything I didn't want him to do.
That's so funny.
and after that point, he admitted defeat. But up till then, he taught me a lot of what I knew. So, yeah.
How were you punished?
Oh no, he was. Well, it's funny because I didn't actually need to let him know, because I could just edit and like he would have never known, but I couldn't keep it to myself. I had to tell him like a couple months down the road, because I was just so happy.
Wow, you lasted a couple of months?
I know, it was hard, but I think he was proud. He was.
Oh, I'm sure he was.
Yeah.
And so you decided to go to USC.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what kind of encouraged that decision?
It was pretty simple. It was the one sort of major university that had a video games program that was halfway decent. So there are many now, but it was one of the first. So.
And why did you gravitate towards game development over other aspects of computer science?
Well, this is so it's funny. When I actually signed up, I went straight to yes, because I was trying to be all professional like, and then I realized that there was no foreign language requirement if you went with the CS Games program, and I always sort of wanted to do it anyway. So that made it an easy decision. But I'm very glad that I did. I think it's one of those things that it's hard to sort of tell at the moment, but it's become like just a ridiculously marketable skill, and I highly recommend anybody who's sort of going through that to sort of look at games.
And you you were working professionally in the space before you graduated, right?
Yeah, I had, I signed on with Disney sort of before, and I'd done lots of sort of side projects, but.
And what did you do with Disney?
So that was fun. I don't think that the department ever actually was formally announced, but we were basically in this secret group trying to hide education in the games that Disney was releasing, and sort of measure. So trying to teach kids concepts and also use games to measure how they were learning. And it was like, I will be pissed if like the majority of learning isn't games in like 20 years, like especially through like middle school and high school. Like,
and so in developing technology that would measure how kids learn, was Disney then using that for its other divisions and sectors? That was proprietary information essentially.
No, yeah, it was, well, so the thing was it never actually, we did lots of cool stuff, but, there was, as Disney is a large company, there's always sort of crazy restructuring. So I got out of there eventually, but the idea was to sort of help the parents understand the progress of their kids.
Huh. Interesting.
And what can you give us an example of like one of the projects you worked on there?
Yes, we worked a lot with Club Penguin. So pretty awesome.
I played that when I was a little kid.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah, dude. When I was like 12 years old, it was on what was it, Mini Clips or something?
Yeah, it was a Flash MMO. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Totally played Club Penguin. Nice. I was secretly being monitored to figure out how my learning was developing. It was awesome.
And it was all above board. I don't want to.
The penguins are out to get me.
I know. We made this one really awesome sort of physics game. It was sort of like a cross between like Angry Birds and Sonic the Hedgehog. We were teaching like phase change and friction and all this kind of stuff.
Wow,
it was fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
How is it? What do you like? What is the coding like, and what is the project development like, and something like that? When you're working with like friction, for example.
Yeah.
Like, how are you diving into that?
So, a lot of it's like our goal wasn't necessarily to like teach kids like the words to use, but get like intuitions around the concepts. And the words might have come with later projects, but so we would do things where there would be sort of like two paths they could take, and like one was like much slipperier than the other, and they'd sort of like have to like rock back and forth on the thing to get enough momentum to go up like the slipperier one. So you'd sort of give them like general ideas around how you sort of deal with different forces and like how like two things with different coefficients of friction sort of interact.
So not necessarily like, teaching them the equations or anything like that, but just developing an intuitive sense of like, oh, this is kind of how these things work.
Right. Yeah. The idea was like, when it actually sort of came to it in the class, they'd be like, oh yeah, I remember X,
Right.
Tell us just a little bit about like the physics engine in the game, because so much of a game's enjoyment is like how physics works in the game. So like how are you improving a physics engine? What is a physics engine? How are you working on it? That kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's I guess the first anecdote that cracks me up still is the guys behind Angry Birds were giving a talk, and somebody was asking them sort of the same question, and they sort of shrugged their shoulders and they're like, we don't know, we have this wildly successful game, but we just use this like box 2D library. And, we're so thankful that it exists, but we have no clue how it came into existence. And just like a guy stands up in the audience and just like raises his hand. He's like, I built that. Physics engines are fascinating because they oftentimes they will use sort of the same equations you'll find in your textbook, but a lot of the times they won't, because they're doing a thing where they're sort of like, a lot of physics equations are like, I want to know the state of this at X time.
Right.
But with games, it's sort of just stepping forward one frame every time. So it changes the way that it works a little bit. And you get sort of crazy scenarios where like, if you shoot a ball at a wall really fast, it's like only checking like every 60th of a second. So the ball can just like completely like punch through the wall and you won't even notice. So you get lots of sort of crazy scenarios. A lot of it comes down to like smoke and mirrors. Right. The joke is always it all comes down to smoke and mirrors, especially smoke and mirrors, because smoke and mirrors is really hard. Yeah, like it's really hard to make things that just always work the way you expect. So you sort of have to do little cheats and hacks here and there to make it sort of disappear. Like one example is pool balls. Whenever you're making like a game with like billiards or whatever, usually you simulate the pool balls as if they were like the size of like beach balls, because the physics simulations are much more stable around the size of a meter than that small. Like you'll get these weird penetration effects and yeah.
Huh.
Interesting.
So, a lot of hard learned tricks. Yeah.
So working forward, because, going from like a pretty phenomenal but very corporate job at Disney and then breaking out.
Hey, you remember the time, yeah?
Yeah, I remember it well. But that was a big sort of leaf change in your life. Can you tell us about like leaving Disney and that whole experience?
Yeah. So I think around that time, there was a sense, and I think this is probably topical to the stuff that you guys talk about, but there was a sense in which I had like hit the level cap, like I'd hit like max level or whatever, or like every like accomplishment that like society, as far as I knew, had like set out for me, I had like gotten through. Yeah. Where like I graduated on time, I got out, I got the good job, I got the apartment, all that kind of stuff. But like there was, I wasn't having like a lot of satisfaction with it, and I couldn't quite figure out what the next step was, like what the sort of end game was, or where there was to go. And so eventually I just realized like I just need to shake this thing up. So I did. I'm sure this story probably comes up on the show a number of times, but I backpacked through Southeast Asia, right? And
that's what I did too.
Nice. Yeah, so much fun. But just that there's this. I compare it to video games a lot, that sort of solo travel where there's a sort of flow state that you're in because there's like just enough challenge where you're like constantly sort of engaged and like learning new skills. Right. And you can sort of like easily modulate the challenge by like, roughing it one night or staying in a nicer hotel or doing whatever. And so I think that's probably why that's such a common sort of growth thing for people, is they're able to like just sort of throttle up their sort of challenge.
Right. Definitely agree.
And you also did it in kind of an exciting way before you left too, right, Gavin? You decided to do something very particular with your possessions.
Oh yeah, I did. I sold absolutely everything.
Really? Everything you owned?
Literally everything. I had. So I kept my car and I like packed a few things into the trunk of my car, but everything else is just in the backpack on my back.
Awesome.
So yeah, I just lived out of a backpack for it was up until basically AltSpace. So it was a good 2 or 3 years that I just had a backpack and a car.
2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think altogether.
Wow.
And I remember at the time you had these huge Post-its on your wall, and you were kind of whittling your possessions down to, I think you had a number. Like you're like, I need under 100, or I need under 50, or whatever it was.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, it's hard. Like I think probably the lowest, if I had to guess, the lowest I ever got was like 200. But even that is like 200 possessions can like easily fit in the trunk of a car. Like, and now it was funny. It was hard to like get stuff again. Like getting furniture again was like painful. But eventually I got past that. Most of my furniture collapses, so at least I have that. But
yeah. And what was the impulse there behind the getting rid of the possessions? I mean, I know from my end, like the purging of material goods is incredibly satisfying. But like, why were you just sort of like shedding a skin? Did you feel like, or is there a philosophical underbelly?
I think there was. I definitely think of sort of phases of my life, and there was a sense where I was sort of wrapping that one up, putting a bow on it, and moving on. There was also sort of a practical sense of I'd always been very messy before then, and the trick that I realized is it's very hard to be messy when you don't have very much stuff, and so I was able to sort of kickstart into getting organized, which I really appreciated, and I've sort of maintained that through. So that was one of my favorite sort of life hacks at that time, was just only having one pen. It always goes
my pen.
Yeah.
I think that's a really clear example of how millennials cannot suck, because I feel like we are a generation of and I'm talking about the privileged of we.
Yes.
We're able to hoard a bunch of shit because the cost of material items in Target and Toys R Us when we're kids is really inexpensive. So millennials had like a lot of stuff lying around, I feel like more so than our parents' generation. So it's easy for us to maintain a kind of ADD style with our material possessions because we have so many of them. And
I would challenge that you can actually flip that a little bit. And in this thing, there may be some aspects of this which aren't great, but there's a sense in which like I use that to the advantage of being a minimalist because I know that like I don't feel bad about getting rid of, a book or a set of playing cards or something like that because I know I can get it off of Amazon again in 24 hours, right? So that helps me be a little more free in getting rid of stuff.
Yeah, true. Makes sense.
Would you say there's a connection in your kind of personal philosophy between, you stripped everything, a lot of things away from your life. You kind of went out on the road. You made it so all you really needed was whatever you had on your back, to starting a company where really all you need is a headset to enter into a different world. To not like, you're not starting like a manufacturing company. You're not starting like, a thing where you need physical objects. You're starting a thing where you don't need any objects.
Yeah, it's a funny way of putting it. I wouldn't doubt that there's probably some subconscious attraction to minimalism. So I guess maybe the way I'll talk about that is I think that is a long line in a history of ways in which technology has made it easier to be a minimalist, right? So like you look at some of those hilarious pictures online of like a cell phone sitting there and it says like, 2010 or whatever. And then you got like the pile of boom boxes and video recorders and, just a mountain of electronics, right? And so there's a sense in which you can survive with very little now because of the march of technology. And I think VR and AR and all these things are going to make that even easier.
And, you just mentioned AR versus VR. Can you talk about kind of what the differences between those two are for those that don't know, and also just how you see them evolving differently and how they'll what the differences we might expect going forward will be?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start it off by saying I expect that we probably won't have a difference, or the difference will be minimal in like 10 years or whatever it is. But as of right now, the way it works is VR is taking over your entire perceptual system, right? So like the only thing you see is what the VR goggles are showing you.
Right.
So you feel like you're somewhere completely different. And AR, on the other hand, sort of overlays stuff on your existing vision. So, you might see a tea kettle that's like sitting there that wasn't actually there, or you might see like a hologram of a person, but it's only taking up a small part of your vision. And VR is further along to consumerization at this point. And it's sort of out there in the wild. AR is sort of slowly, or it's going much faster than people expected, just like VR does. But it's going to take a while before that's sort of in everybody's hands in the same way that VR is. The nice thing is that the software is roughly the same in a lot of ways. So whatever software companies like hopefully us that exist will be able to make that transition very easily.
And I noticed there's like an insane explosion of mega investment in AR right now.
Like Magic Leap.
Is that because of the gamification of its applications? Is it because of the military applications? I'm sure there's an insane amount of investment in both, but we've both been reading a lot of articles about, these huge investors in AR. Do you see the same level of investment in VR? Is there a discrepancy? And where would that discrepancy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's just sort of general excitement. I mean, you look at, Facebook buying Oculus for $2 billion or whatever.
Right.
It's sort of my favorite set of numbers. I think, let me see if I can remember what it was. It was like, it took them 2 years to go from like a $2 million Kickstarter that had its goal set at like $200,000 to getting bought for $2 billion. Right. So just.
It's a lot of additional zeros in a short amount of time.
Exactly. Yeah. Just this crazy skyrocketing. And so, yeah, I think there's just general excitement. I think, there's some companies like Apple where, they may come out with VR goggles, but I know Tim Cook has said as much where like AR just fits their company image a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
Like it's hard to sort of see them wandering up on stage with a thing over their face where you can't see their eyes, and it just doesn't quite fit their marketing as much. So that sounds like a silly sort of reason for them, but they're very design focused. So, and I think it's easier for people to sort of stomach the idea of transparent lenses. But obviously VR is just so compelling that you sort of get past the weirdness of it very quick.
You talked about how in 10 years you think it's all going to be the same. What do you think the hinge point for that will be?
Just a lot of it's the display technology. We can't render dark in AR right now. You can shine lights in your eyes, but you can't shine dark in your eyes.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Like a stupid little problem, but you can imagine how like electronic ink displays of some kind might be able to do that. Or my favorite is actually the pass-through AR, where you have like a VR headset with cameras on the outside of it, and it sort of passes the image through. And so you can actually do this right now with like the Gear VR, and it blows your mind because you like go and look in a mirror, and it's just a fucking robot looking back at you because it's just the back of the cell phone. Yeah, you're looking yourself in your like robot camera eye, and it's weird. But the thing is that works now, right? And that leverages like both the rapid growth in VR and also rapid growth in cameras, especially sort of micro cameras and light field cameras and stuff like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see sort of things that look more like helmets, maybe. But who knows? Magic Leap will come out with their stuff. But yeah, that's VR for you and AR. Lots of fun stuff there. But
and that's like the future. Where do you see us headed in the short term? Like where do you think it'll first explode onto the market in a real way? I mean, I know it's out there, but it hasn't quite hit. There's not a goggle craze. There's not a VR craze yet. Where do you think that's going to happen first? Is it games or porn, or where do you think it'll happen first?
I think right now the biggest challenge is just the accessibility and design of like usability of the headsets and sort of the presence of them in the marketplace, right? So like AltSpace becomes more and more compelling the more people are in there,
right?
And so like the big thing that will be fascinating to watch is Google's Daydream program. If they do a good job there, they can basically like flip the switch overnight and have every Android phone become like a Gear VR level VR device.
Wow.
And so that's, you're talking about like, hundreds of millions or billions of devices out there just overnight. So, yeah, that's where it starts getting crazy.
You talked a little bit about how for you guys, for AltSpace, it becomes interesting the more people that are involved in the space. And your niche is very socially dependent. Mm-hmm. And we've seen how social media, social networking has really changed in certain ways how humans interact with each other and human behavior on a micro and a macro scale. I'm curious, have you thought about, I'm sure you have, about how human behavior will change as a result of kind of VR or what you're trying to do?
I mean, I hope that there's a sense in which communication barriers drop a lot, right? So there's a sense in which me and Matt don't play D&D anymore because we're in different cities. But if it was, in AltSpace we have D&D, but it's definitely not trivial yet. But if it was just as easy as sort of pulling your phone out of your pocket and all of a sudden you were in a game, or if you're trying to solve a problem and all of a sudden someone in Bangladesh can jump in there and help you, and it just feels exactly like you're there. I think it's bringing down those geographic barriers that are probably the biggest sort of social change I think we'll see. But the other place where it gets fascinating is like you look at like how technology changes like the social affordances that we have, right? And like the different events that we go to. So like, there's this very, there's a sense in which we had like clubs before, right? And people were parts of clubs. And then like meetup.com came along where it's like, no, there's meetups. And like meetups are subtly different than clubs. They're like more open and like they happen more frequently. And there's like, there's more in different types of cities. And like you think about like there was speed dating and then like Tinder came along and all of a sudden like, so there's these like new ways of like humans to interact with each other in a social context that like technology has sort of mediated. And I don't know what those are going to be for VR yet, but that will be a very fascinating thing to watch.
So just like the things being immediacy growing essentially in ways that we don't know yet.
Watching the new type of groups of people interacting with each other in different ways.
Well, it's like Skype brought you into a video contact with somebody, and then a new VR platform will be like could be the next extension of that, where you're actually in the living room with somebody, and it's that feeling of being just that much closer. So, Gav, VR is it's a hot topic, and it's in the press a lot. You mentioned the acquisition, $2 billion acquisition of Facebook, of Oculus by Facebook. And, I think it begs the question, like, how do you see VR and tech in general fitting into other prescient things like, the election, for example? Like, how is tech a counterweight or not a counterweight to what's happening in our political space?
Yeah. So I guess as a sort of segue, we do actually have like election events going on in AltSpace right now up until election night. So we had Al Roker in there yesterday.
Cool.
Got to meet him, and we have like a virtual copy of that Democracy Plaza in New York. So we'll be doing like watch parties and stuff like that. Huh. But sort of outside of VR, there's been, it's been one of the things that's been fascinating for me is I haven't really I never was sort of big on Facebook for a while until sort of moving to the Bay Area. But one of the things that has made that really, really useful lately and made me use that more was the sort of very, very powerful discussions that I've seen going on there around the election, right? So there's, it's sort of this civilizational pivot point that we're looking at here. And so it's gotten a lot of people trying to think strategically about how we can, help sort of influence it in the right direction. And so I've had a few friends that have been like, they'll do just like weeks of research and then write these like, 2-page long Facebook posts, sort of trying to break down just like, what sort of what's going on in like different states and different counties and, how to help. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting that we're trying to do is try to spread some like a few different like memes that have come out of the community. So like one of the ones that I just love because it changed my mind on voting. And so I'm trying to help convince others to take a look at it is there's this term called expected value, where it's sort of I take an action not because like I know it's going to have a specific effect, but I know that like on average, or like if I did this 1,000 times and like added up all the results, it would like have X value, right? So if you imagine like, you pull a lever and like, every 100 times it gives you like $1,000, right? You can sort of like factor that out and think like each lever pull is, I don't know, is it $10 or whatever the math works out to. And so there's this very interesting calculation that you can do on voting where most people will say like, my vote doesn't matter, right? And I used to sort of think that like, oh, well, like if I just went and like worked for an extra hour and like donated that money to charity, like that would be way better than like actually driving to the polls and voting. But you have to so there's two things you have to take into account. One is that the chances of you influencing the outcome of the election is very, very small, but it's not zero. And the federal budget is really, really big. And so if you take like whatever it is, $15 trillion over the course of 4 years, the federal budget, and you like multiply it through like the 1 in 10 million chance of you influencing the outcome of election, like an average state, you like, and it depends on some personal factors, but like you end up with like a effective or expected value of your vote in like the thousands or sometimes even millions of dollars.
Wow.
So you're basically like donating like $100,000 to charity when you like go and donate to your vote, your when you go and vote. And so like it obviously becomes like the rational thing to do.
Yeah.
I would love to see that.
I gotta see those studies.
Yeah, if you could send that, I would love for us to be able to post that and put it in our show notes and everything.
Yeah, I will definitely do that. So yeah, we've been trying to figure out like what the best way to get the message out is through like infographics or whatever it is. So if you guys have any people who are good with that kind of stuff, definitely let me know. But I'll send you
we will connect you to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll send you the Facebook post. That came out of the rationality community. It's kind of less wrong, but yeah, I'll write that down.
So that's amazing. And this is the second time you've mentioned the rationality community. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? And like, that's a super powerful example of how they work, but tell us more about it.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's well, what is it? The joke about the Matrix, right? I can't tell you what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
Right.
It's hard to sort of explain, but it is. So one of the big places it came out of was this site called Less Wrong, and so it's not that you're trying to get more right, you're trying to get less wrong, right? It's more scientifically accurate, and so you'll get people that are basically just trying to break everything down, and there's a sense that like. This is stretching it a little bit, but there's a sense that like rationality is just like winning, like it's trying to like achieve your goals in like a better way. And so sometimes that'll involve like people often think about rationality as this like Spock thing, right? Where it's like not in touch with your emotions, but like no, we're like creatures that are driven by our emotions. So like a lot of it's like figuring out how to like get yourself in the right mental states or like, adjust your emotions or figure out like sort of what makes, so like one of the things that, that's sort of related to that is there's this issue where a lot of people really don't want Donald Trump to win, but have like a hard time getting excited about Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we've been talking a little bit about is like, if you actually think if you really want to stop Trump and like thus like the only way to do that is for Hillary Clinton to win, it like probably is rational to try to make yourself more emotionally excited about Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Huh. So the rational being able to rationally change your emotions about something.
Right. And there's like, there's sort of subtle ways to do that. There's like, you can just be like, okay, I want to do that. Well, let me go watch like Bill Clinton say nice things about her. Right. Or you be like, oh, let me like, just like think about how awesome it's going to be to like, see all the little girls like be very excited about the first woman president. Like there's all these sort of like emotional hooks that you can sort of search for. But that would just be sort of like one example of how that connects to sort of the like modern sort of political situations. But yeah, it goes, it's the first time I've ever felt just really like I had like a large sort of core community where like we all have the same values and not necessarily all the same values, but like that really nice core set of values. It just, it's probably a community of, I don't know, 400 or 500 people out here. But just everybody sort of working together on sort of common projects and writing blog posts and trying to figure out, it broke out into the effective altruism community a little bit. So that sort of spans the Atlantic. There's a lot of folks over in the UK working on that as well. But it's basically like, how do you sort of use rationality in science to do the most good possible, right?
So that's effective altruism.
That's effective altruism, yeah.
And why would a scientific community think it would be good to not be self-interested, but instead be interested in good for others? Where's the rationale there?
Yeah, let's see if I can do that. There's sort of lots of, so I'll say that there's like many paths to sort of consequentialism and utilitarianism, where you sort of like care about the state of the world and like the things that have moral weight in the world are like intelligent creatures or something like that, right? So I don't know if I'll do justice to like all the different paths there. I know like mine was. One of the ones that I say sort of in jest is it's way more interesting to have like a epic quest than not to have one, right? Like there's a certain point in which like hedonism just like isn't interesting anymore.
Sure.
So that's sort of like the cop-out answer, but there's lots of sort of like deep philosophical and sort of different ways of getting there. But the bottom line is once you've sort of like decided that like the universe would be better if there was like more happy humans and like less sad humans. You can start to really look at these problems in at least somewhat objective ways. Both sort of like taking a specific cause and trying to figure out like the best way of solving that cause, or trying to figure out like what the more important causes are. So like one of the examples is, looking at the effectiveness of charity, not just like the overhead, right?
Right.
You look, and Matt, I know you're intimately familiar with all this, but like there's one great charity that's just Give Directly, right, where they just do direct wire transfers to people's cell phones in Africa, right?
Right.
And so it's like, if your charity could not do better than this, like this is the baseline. This is how we do it. But the nice thing about them is that combining some technology, they actually use like satellite imagery to look down at people's houses and see if they have like metal roofs or not, right? And so they'll send the cash transfers if people have like thatch roofs, because they think that it's going to do sort of more good. And then they'll actually do sort of they'll do like actual studies, right? So they'll sort of like have, for lack of a better word, like control groups, and so they'll try to actually measure the effectiveness of their charity as they're doing it.
And that's really in the space like the only way that charity is going to improve. Because it has been so dominated by only emotional actors. I don't mean actors in the Hollywood sense. I mean emotional actors in the stakeholder sense. And so a lot of people acting from a place of I should, or it'll make me feel better,
or from a place of guilt, or whatever. From a place of
guilt, right, etc. And the only way that sort of what could be thought of as like a good human impulse to help others is going to become more and more in a state of efficacy is if there is that feedback loop of research,
right? Because
without that, you can end up doing more harm than good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And so that's cool. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Gavin, you talked a little bit as well about this idea of existential risk, and I'm wondering how that plays into all this, and how that plays into kind of what you think about at night.
Yeah. So that's sort of like one of the big three in EA. So you have sort of, generally speaking, like the three big topics that people are interested in at the moment is like global poverty, animal rights, and X risk. And so existential risk is basically anything that would threaten the extinction of the species, right? And to get technical, it's either the species goes extinct or it's like permanently curtailed. Like we never like rebuild medicine. Like we're just sort of scraping along.
Right.
And so, there's a sort of like common tropes of like asteroid strikes and super volcanoes. And, but when you get down and you actually like look at like what are the chances behind a lot of these things, almost all of them that have any sort of reasonable chance of happening in the next, say, 100 years are all sort of man-made, right? So, you're looking at things like artificial intelligence, artificial plagues. Let's see. You get like a whole category. So you have like nanotechnology. And then you get like a whole category of like global catastrophic risks that might turn into X risks. So you have, say, a big solar flare, right? And with a big solar flare, people don't realize this, but like it could knock out basically every large transformer in the United States easily. And so like, and those take like, as far as I understand, they take like years to build over in like Europe and like ship over here. And so like the US power grid could be down for like a decade. Like it's just crazy that we like live with these things, and people aren't trying to.
Are there and there's no contingency?
Not really. Yeah. I mean, so that one actually, thankfully, is moving through the government right now. That one's crazy. I think it only takes like $50 million to solve. It's some crazy sort of thing in the large scheme of things. But so basically, you have to just like put either automated or manual like switches that you can throw on these things to disconnect them from the grid. Ideally, you would have like a sort of early warning probe out there that could tell us, but in the lack of a better thing, we can sort of see it from here and act in time. But so, one of the big ones is that artificial intelligence, right? And this is one that gets a little weird because, people have all these sort of like preconceived sci-fi notions around like Terminator and stuff like that. And so some people just, think it's going to be exactly like Terminator. And some people think like, oh, that's just sci-fi, don't worry about it. But like when you actually start looking through the like game theoretical like aspects of like what happens when you have super intelligent agents that have like specific utility functions and are like trying to like solve really complicated math problems, well, they're like going to need all the computers possible to do it. And like humans are made of parts that can turn into computers. And like you get all these sort of things where everything gets bad really quickly if we get these certain types of AI systems.
Right.
So, yeah, that's, yeah.
Is that like a realistic worry for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's of the likely things to kill us in the next 100 years. I think AI is either first or second on that list.
What would be the other first or second?
The other one would be some kind of biotechnology disaster, probably some sort of like weaponized plague that sort of accidentally got released or something like that.
And so in this community, you talk about these things. Is there anything, do you write white papers to suggest policy around, doing the best you can to avoid them? Or is there any action steps to this field?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of really great organizations that have spun up in the last couple of years. So MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, has been one of the ones that's been working on AI for the longest. They're up in Berkeley.
Nice.
I have a lot of friends who sort of work there. And then there's been a lot. So like Elon Musk just donated a bunch of money to one. There's like the Future of Life Institute. So yeah, so there's a lot of sort of organizations that have sprung up and will sort of like hold. So you know how they have like TED and TEDx?
Yeah.
We'll sort of hold like MIRI X workshops.
Nice.
Where like people who are like semi good at math will sort of get together and like help try to solve some of the math problems, or work together on some of these harder issues. And so a lot of it's just, sort of like talking, working through things, trying to like, figure out where people are sort of maybe making errors. And then a lot of it is there is a sense in which earning to give is like a very valuable option, right? And that's one of the things that's really strongly come out of the EI community is there's a sense in which, and this is you can extrapolate this out too far for different jobs, but if you imagine sort of like certain like roles in, say, like the Peace Corps, where you're sort of going to maybe somewhere in Africa and doing a job that doesn't necessarily take maybe it's unskilled, or like it's skilled but a occupation that is relatively common, right?
Sure.
So even like a job like software engineering or mechanical engineering or something like that, if you didn't take that job, somebody else would have taken the job, right? And so like the only marginal value that you're adding is how much better you would be than every other candidate. And so you're actually better off oftentimes like working for like a bank or like doing some other sort of high earning position and donating the money, because then they can hire an extra person sort of rather than filling the slot. Yeah.
So if you can be successful in something that seems a bit more boring, you should be, so that you can take that and give it to other people.
Yeah, so that's one heuristic, and obviously there's failure modes, right? Where like if somebody says they're going to do that and then they actually like, they really like the rich life, right? Or
I'm not giving it away.
Yeah, or the other, and then this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Is that there's a lot of roles where it's more organizationally constrained than like talent and money constrained.
Sure.
So like there's a lot of places, and I know you probably are again familiar with this, Matt, but it's just like the shit has to get done, and there's people who have like special domain knowledge in the area, and so like those jobs aren't easily replaceable. Like it's not the sort of thing where you can just trade one person in for another.
Right.
And so there's lots of positions that are like that, but it's sort of like if that's not exactly sort of if you're not coming in with sort of an unfair advantage or like very specific domain knowledge, then yeah, the earning to give stuff does become an important thing. So
interesting.
So, Gav, we're probably going to wrap up here soon. You've been with us for an hour and 15, which is awesome. And I guess, what we've sort of the tone that we've come into is this idea of existential risk, and this community, this EA community that kind of addresses it. So, I'm assuming you're spending a lot of your time thinking about these ways that human beings can sort of not lose as well, or win better or not lose. So as you're mired in all this, as you're steeped in all this, are you hopeful? How do you think we come out on balance? Do you think we're going to assess these existential risks and knock them out of the park, or you think we're all going to get killed by a solar flare, or what do you feel like? What do you feel like the future holds?
Yeah, I think I think I have precisely two minds on this, right? So like, one is, you look at the numbers and like the numbers don't necessarily look great. There's a very thin sort of needle we have to thread through a lot of these.
Right.
Nice.
And there's a lot of parallel universes where this is going to go badly. But at the same time, it's hard to act that way, right? It's hard to live that way. And so you have to sort of calibrate towards all these things being bad, and we have to like expect that we're overly optimistic, and we have to work to solve them. But the more that we can make that work positive and inspiring and not like worrying, if that makes sense,
sure,
the better. So
basically to give other people hope too.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to have hope while acknowledging the dangers. Yeah.
Expect the best, but prepare for the worst.
Exactly. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, man. This has really been an intellectually stimulating and super interesting conversation.
Yeah, always feel
like I learned something when I talk to you, Gavin.
Yeah. Likewise, man.
All right. So
all right, man.
So much, Gavin.
We'll talk to you again soon. We'll have to have you back on when when maybe the robots right before they start taking over.
Sounds like a plan.
Great.